it's amazing. Like, we live in the future and it's okay to take joy in that sometimes and be aware of the consequences.
Welcome to an interview episode of Tech in the Arts, brought to you by the Arts Management and Technology Lab at Carnegie Mellon University. My name is Elizabeth Forey, the Chief Editor of Research, and I'm joined today with our summer social media and marketing manager, Marika Lumhold.
Hello.
To speak with Jacob Gursky, student of privacy engineering at Carnegie Mellon University and former researcher at the University of Texas.
Today, we're talking with Jacob about Ghostbots and Griefbots. Liz, can you tell us about the technology that powers Ghostbots and Griefbots?
Yeah, so generative AI is basically a type of artificial intelligence that uses machine learning algorithms that basically generates artificial content, fake content, but is real, quote unquote, because it basically takes existing audio files, media files, videos, images, or anything of that sort of a specific individual and, analyzes them, making new content that is believable and hyper realistic to what that person would have said or done or looked like. So basically, generative AI creates something that is new content, but is completely believable to be content related to the person it has been curated from. But could you tell us a bit about, Ghostbots and Griefbots, because that's what generative AI is applied to and kind of what that means?
Yeah, so Ghostbots are taking those inputs that you just spoke to and creating new content via AI, but specifically around someone, a person who is dead. So we're essentially creating a digital AI-powered version of them today after they are no longer physically alive. And in the case of Griefbots, they're used specifically to help grieving people. So grieving people can create a digital version, a Griefbot of someone that they love, that they've lost. So all Griefbots in this case are Ghostbots, and then some Ghostbots are Griefbots. So let's hear more from Jacob Gursky, who researched these applications.
We'll just start off with our first question that we have. So can you take a moment to explain the technology framing your research into Ghostbots, which is generative AI, with a couple of examples for our listeners?
So generative text and generative AI, that examples that really stand out to me. One would be there's a project called AI Dungeon, which was a generative text model of like almost Dungeons and Dragons. Like, you could create any fantasy world you want and explore it. Say explore or like stab the troll, make friends with the troll, and it responds. But that's all pre-written. So basically, you can build these models of that generate the adventure for you in this AI dungeon world. And it sort of led to this like ideological war of like, the more we put into this AI, the more it's going to produce things like this, and also maybe it's producing some things that are misogynistic, and is that just a reflection of the people who are using this? And it's this really interesting case study, but that's an example that stands out to me. And another one that really sticks out to me from the time I worked at the University of Texas for a while, we hosted this event called CogSec, which I definitely recommend looking at. But it was called Cognitive Security, and we had all these guest speakers come in and talk about protecting people from systematic disinformation. And one of the speakers was this, like, I think he did this during his freshman year as like a final project, and it kind of got him in some trouble. But what he did was, when regulators are making new regulations, they have to post those things online for a certain amount of time for public comments. And so what this student did was he generated, like, I think it was like, if there were 80,000 comments made on this law, 60,000 were his or something like that. And he was able to generate unique comments that were with a valence of like, this law is terrible or this law is great. And he did it without permission. And then but he marked them all. So he wrote a letter to them afterwards and said like, hey, I did this. You can control F for like this specific text string and remove all the fake ones. Ideally, you get permission for that sort of thing. I think that's probably more. He was probably more gray hat than white hat. Yeah, he proved that this could be done, and as sort of like the counterpoint to this, like the benefits of the technology is that you can generate entire fake articles sometimes, or fake articles that look real in the beginning and people never read through the first two paragraphs and you don't realize it, or generate these fake comments as an attack vector to sort of usurp our democracy, which is a phrase I hope doesn't come up again, but probably will.
And I guess kind of on that realm of things, you've obviously talked a little bit about like the harm it does do, generative AI. And I'm just wondering, like in your research, have you, besides the examples you've just talked about, can you talk about what Ghostbots are specifically and how they are different from generative AI itself, or why they're a different class of generative AI? And if there's any psychological problems you have uncovered in your research regarding this?
Yeah, the idea is that you create a version of a person that you could speak with after they've passed away. And if you've seen Black Mirror, there's a really great episode about a woman whose husband passes away, and then like by the end of the episode, she's recreated him.
I've seen the episode; it's scary.
Yeah.
that episode doesn't become really fiction until she like 3D prints him a new body. Basically, like the technology for that is in development and or is possible. So there's a couple of companies that do this or are working on it. So the three main players that I found were Hereafter AI, Eternomy, which was sort of a startup that kind of just disappeared from what I could tell, and Replica. And they're all sort of different in their execution of this in that I think comparing would be really interesting. And then there's another one that I found called Mindbank AI, what Hereafter was somebody whose father was passing away and he wanted to preserve a way to interact with him for his grandchildren. And then Replica was somebody whose partner passed away. And with Hereafter, it doesn't seem like there's that much actually generative going on. It's more like a really, really advanced diary, sort of. Like you can ask it questions and then it will respond, but it's sort of this branching tree of pre-recorded responses. It doesn't really, from what I could tell, it doesn't really generate conversation. Whereas Replica is more generative. But Replica sort of has this weird middle ground where it doesn't directly say it can recreate you. It just sort of says it will create you a friend. And so people who pour time into Replica get stuck there. Well, I don't know if that's the right word for it, but they really get intimately connected with this digital person. And it's because a digital person is a feedback loop with them, like learning from them and becoming their friend. But my take on Replica with that is that the marketing's kind of careful to not claim that it's recreating someone directly, whereas Hereafter is. So I feel like the technology, at least in like the commercial sector, is in this weird middle ground where the generative stuff isn't quite there. Like technology exists to do it, but having it be feasible, the generative stuff is not quite there to create a generative model of your loved one, but you can still pay to create a sort of advanced diary. There were different tiers of how much of your loved one you could save depending on how much you were willing to pay. And you could pay flat rate, but there were also like subscription services like Netflix. And it makes me wonder, like if one day like I have to choose between paying my Netflix subscription or being able to talk with my deceased grandparent, I don't know how I feel about that. So I sort of see these apps as like everything sort of right now. The technology isn't bad, but I already see them falling into the traps of the business models and incentive structures that have defined the technology we've built so far.
Wow. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
A lot to think about.
So you've already touched on some of the moral and ethical implications around some of the applications of generative AI, but it does seem like there are differences perhaps in the application of how it's used. Like I know something we've talked about is Dali Lives at the Salvador Dali Museum, which for listeners who are unaware is an AI-powered recreation of the artist Salvador Dali that visitors can interact with. So that's used in like an educational setting to help people get an understanding of this historical figure and artist. But then there are other applications like you touched on with some of the apps that are used as like a companion and used in a much more private setting. Do you think there are differences in morality amongst those different kinds of applications for generative AI?
Yes, I think that there is a difference. I'm not saying that either one is right or wrong necessarily, but I think what you have to look at is why it was possible to create Dolly Lives, and why, if it's not possible to do that with somebody else who lived contemporaneous with him necessarily. Because to build these models of people, you have to have a lot of information about them. And for Dolly Lives, because he was such a public figure, they were able to find so many recordings and things that he wrote. But that's sort of standard of only these people who are hyper in the public eye have this much information about them, so this can be done. And whether or not it's ethical to do that, I don't know. Is it different because has already sort of signed his life to being a public figure on purpose? I don't know. So with Dolly Lives, it's like it's a little bit different because he's already in the public eye and you have all this information. But now you have to think about how all that information, probably more information exists about us in this podcast right now than exists about Dali. Uh, because we don't have any control over it for a lot of it. So I think that the moral questions are really who gets to build these these models, and what are they doing, and are they kind of already out there, and is it important that they're accurate? There's a school of thought about digital doppelgangers, which is this idea that your data creates another version of you, that has no rights. It can be passed around like to different companies. And it might not even be accurate to you. But that version of you who you don't have control over and who you don't who might not even be accurate to you is used to make decisions about you. So in a way, these like AI generated yous are it's a very upfront and in your face version of something that you could argue is already happening. So I think that it's pretty inseparable from like who will own and control these versions of yourself, and as where does the data come from, and do you have recourse, especially after you pass away? There are schools of thought around how like post-mortem privacy and things like that, which I think are really important, but you don't even have a lot of mortem rights to the way your data is used to create versions of you. So in a way, I think that it's a very interesting technology, but it's also a very useful pedagogical tool to make you think about how your data is a part of you. It's fundamental to who you are, and it affects you in ways that might not be obvious, but can have huge impacts on your life.
Do you think with these privacy concerns that the biggest concern is what you were just saying about the individual who these generative AIs are based on, and how things could be misconstrued, misrepresented from who they actually were without their permission? Or do you think there are also concerns about the living person who is quote unquote owning that Griefbot, for example, or another application of it?
Yeah, I think so. They're not just called Ghostbots; they're also called Griefbots, which I think is even more indicative of why it could be dangerous. I think technology right now has a long, proud tradition of being predatory and like to people's sort of weakest moments. And I'm not just pulling this out of nowhere. A couple of years ago, I was on a road trip across the United States, and I ended up on Stanford's campus for a day. And when I'm ever on a new campus, I like to just follow groups of students around at like not creepy distance, but just like figure out where people are going to class, and if the class is big enough that I could just sit and see a lecture for 40 minutes and learn about something I may not have otherwise. And this one class I sat in was the guest speaker had worked for, I think, Instagram and Netflix and maybe even Facebook. She was cycling through like what it would take, what you need to have in mind if you're trying to get people to adopt your technology. And she brought up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And she pointed to the bottom of the needs. She pointed to like the base human needs and said, you need to appeal to this. I just thought that was wildly dystopic, like to say we have all of this technology, and she wasn't doing it in a way to say, oh, use technology to help people find housing or food or something. She was saying, no, if you want to break into this market, you have to appeal to people on their most base, vulnerable level, was my takeaway. And I think that these Griefbots hit people in that space. Losing someone you love is an incredibly vulnerable position and difficult.
Wow. So kind of in this realm of everything you just spoke about, including, the privacy and, protecting people from especially grieving people, because if this tech is exploiting people at their basic level of need, or that is an intention, what kind of privacy laws or self-implemented practices do you think would need to be created to avoid some of these privacy issues with the Ghostbots and the Griefbots and other generative AI as such?
Well, the first thing that pops into my head are the fair information practice principles, because most of my degree is memorizing different frameworks for thinking about privacy because nobody has a single definition. So, and those are, it's notice, choice, access, security, and enforcement. So you could kind of go through an interesting, not that that's the only framework, and man, I hope those are actually the FIPS, or otherwise all the privacy engineers are going to be after me. Um, but so I don't know, maybe we could do like a thought experiment together where it's like, what would each of those things look like for a technology like this? So notice would have to happen before the person passed away, right? And so you'd have to let people know that this is happening. And one of the key things is the ability to withdraw consent, which is, how do you do that after you've passed away? A lot of the principles are just the basic things that need to happen with any of our data. And with the added difficulty of somebody deceased being involved. So I think that this is very it's not a unique conversation. It's very similar to what's already being discussed about people's Facebook accounts after they passed away and things like that. So getting clear notice from the person who this is being built about is the first and foremost thing. Yeah. Having somebody trusted who can make those decisions after they've passed away. Also, making it really clear the limitations of this, especially if this becomes something that exists over time, because eventually the people who are with you to say, no, Jacob would never say that, Ghost Jacob, or Ghost Jacob, why I don't remember you loving Coca-Cola so much. Won't be around. So eventually the only thing that'll be left of you is this version, and that will inform the memories of people. One of the key rights that people are trying to build into laws right now is the right to fix data that's inaccurate, know what the data is and know how to fix it. And there are key issues to that when you're dealing with somebody who's deceased. I guess the answer is I don't really know, but it's not that separate from conversations that are already happening and innovations that are already happening in the legal space around this. The CCPA, the California Privacy Law, has the ability for you to give a third party the right to execute your data rights and in various ways.
Okay.
So and including through power. I'm not sure power of attorney is the right word, but in a legal sense, that people can make those decisions. So that's something that could be considered with these Griefbots. But again, you run into a sort of a class issue there, where the only people who are able to it would take a lot of money to have a legal team make sure that you're represented well. The issues, what will happen to this data, remain prescient even after the ability to have consent is gone. So you fundamentally can't withdraw consent after you passed away. So I don't know what the way around that is, but I think a good thing would be having people store their data maybe more locally. It doesn't have to be stored out there in the world somewhere. But then you're getting into decentralization, which is just a mess within itself sometimes. So
a whole other topic.
Yeah.
Right. I've done some research on data privacy, and it's basically you have to decentralize, but also yikes. Wow. Hard, right? Because it comes to, and I think back to that, it is death and grief, and the grieving process is, and the morality of having a version of people exist is very questionable after they've passed away. I have had people in my life who have died who still have a Facebook account, and their stuff comes up, and you're like, get rid of it. And sometimes we keep voicemails. I know I have a voicemail of my grandma, and my mom has a voicemail of her, which is her mother, and you don't want to get rid of that, but it's that's already sometimes too much. What happens when there's more, you know? And this all ties back in with how you were saying, like, and we need art to kind of talk about these things. And I think, you know, we talked about Dali Lives, and there's other holograms in your research. You talked about other dead performing artists who go on tour, and like that stuff is common. And so where do you see that these Ghostbots and Griefbots and any other name of this type of artificial intelligence, where do they intersect with the arts industry specifically now and in the future? To kind of close this out.
I think that it's art really has a fundamental way of talking about identity. Like we have the ability to understand that, and so being able to make these technologies accessible to artists, to make these ideas and an understanding of the consequences available to the general public is key to this. Because even if you went to every middle school, high school, college, and try to explain to people the ins and outs of AI and why it's important, that might not be as powerful as like seeing somebody recreated and then maybe seeing something happen that's not great, you know, or is having understanding how amazing the technology is, but having it really in front of you that this Dolly's been recreated, and maybe that could happen to you, and then thinking, wait, I don't know if I would like that. Look at all these people sort of just taking selfies with him over and over and over again for the next 30 years that he's in this exhibit or whatever. And it's like, I don't know if I would like that. And so I think that the role of art in this is to explore the edges of it, and to show that it can be fun, to like, this isn't all just dystopic, that there are spaces and ways where it's okay to play with these things, and it can bring joy and wonder, and it's amazing. Like, we live in the future and it's okay to take joy in that sometimes and be aware of the consequences. So one of the guest speakers we had this semester talked about how like like images, like facial recognition, can be used to identify people with masks on, like at a protest or something, but it can also be used to, like, you recognize your face and turn you into a cat in like while you're talking to somebody on a Zoom call. And I think that art is underappreciated in its ability to add to these conversations in a way that really, really matters. So my big thought from this is, keep bad AI around, especially for art in certain spaces, and just don't, instead of saying, hey, this thing can solve everything, say this thing is sort of an Alice in Wonderland mirror into ourselves. And so I think generative models, like I would love if I felt like there was a way to, like, I wanted to, it was too expensive, but as part of this project, I wanted to create as many different versions of myself as I could in these bots, like these ghost bots of me, some of them with like various levels of truth. Like, I wanted to make up whole life stories about myself that weren't true. And then instead of like trying to keep myself private, I would release like hundreds of fake Jacob Ghostbots about the time that I was in Louisiana and I like stumbled on an alligator in the middle of the road, or the time that I went to Alaska and worked with sled dogs, right? And like one of those stories is actually true. But it's like, who would be able to tell if it was like from the Griefbots? I think keep bad AI around and use it as a window into ourselves. Don't lose that as it becomes cheaper and easier and more accessible. I think that's, once you lose that, you lose insight, and then you're just a technological solutionist, and they haven't solved much.
Wow. I love that. Thank you so much for this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for listening to Tech in the Arts. Be on the lookout for new episodes coming to you very soon. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, be sure to send this to another arts aficionado in your life. You can let us know what you thought by visiting our website, amt-lab.org. That's amt-lab.org. Or you can email us at amtlabcmu@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Tech in the Arts, or on Facebook and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. We'll see you for the next episode.